All right, folks. I think we'll start. There might be 2 or 3 more people that might join us a bit later, but in the interest of not keeping Jared idle.
You guys.
So it's a great honor to have Jared present his book to us, and
Thank you.
I read it. I can say it. In all honesty, it's
You're the only one here. Even I haven't read it.
I think Russell's foreword was exactly spot on, I thought.
Okay.
It's an amazing story. So without further ado, Jared and Iceland Secrets.
It's a pleasure. Maybe we can go to the next slide. I'll just please, it's a small crowd, and I don't even feel that comfortable standing in front of such a. But anyway, just interrupt anytime, because if you're not interrupting, then you're not paying attention. Because some elements of the story are so crazy that you will, I think you'll be shocked. So I will talk a little bit. This is not boring, but I will talk about Icelandic history a little bit, just to give you sort of the background of how people in Iceland, maybe give you some idea of how people think. And then we'll talk about these crazy boom years for about 5 years at the beginning of this, beginning of the century. And then we'll get into this, the world's greatest con, and the mechanics of how Icelandic banks were able to grow so fast and deceive both the public of Iceland and the wider world. So, okay, could we? And then maybe if we have time, we get into these things. So maybe we can go to the next one. Oh, that's just Iceland. So there's a nice picture. I've never had someone advancing the slides. Like, if you can go back to that. So, Keith, why did I choose this picture? Where is this?
Not sure.
Oh, really?
Is it Tigvatla?
No, it's Grundarfjall. So this is on the north side of Snæfellsnes, about 3 hours from Reykjavik. And the white-collar prison of Iceland is kind of like over this hill, I think. So some of the people in this story went to that prison for just a very few months at the end of the story. So, okay, now we can talk about Iceland's history. So Iceland is both kind of a proud old country and a young nation. So Iceland was settled in 874, it was the first settler, and by 930, not 1930, but 930, Iceland has a parliament, which is still running today.
Wow.
There was a break in the 19th century for some years, but the parliament is more, the Alþingi is the parliament, it's more or less been running for more than 1,000 years, almost, what, 1,100? Right? Can't do the math, standing up here. And in this time, so the parliament is not like, people are not going and voting, and it was like the wealthy landholder of each region was the representative of his people from that region, and they would get together at Thingvellir, which takes a long time to get to across the country, on horseback, and they'd meet there for 2 weeks, and they'd have nothing was written down, so they had a law speaker who just had all the laws memorized, and he would first just recite all the laws so that they could remember what all the laws were, and then they would make new laws, and then he would add them to his mental list, and then they had like court proceedings and stuff as well, and yeah, so that was how the parliament worked, and there was also great stories called the Sagas. Saga is an Icelandic word which means like an old saw, or to saw something. And the old stories of Iceland were called the Sagas, and they were passed down also orally at that time. But in the 1200s, they were written down. They think by one man. He found scraps of sheepskin and wrote them down. And that's how we know today, like Norse mythology is actually Icelandic mythology, because it was written down by this one Iceland. Okay, so, and this is the Commonwealth period, so there's no king, there's no nobles, there's just this parliament and Vikings and farmers, and it's great times. But they didn't have any way to enforce the laws that they made. There was no police force. There was no executive branch of the country. So they ran into trouble when these clans got into disputes that they couldn't settle. And so finally, in the 1200s, 1262, they appeal to the Norwegian king, and they say, we'd like to come under the Norwegian kingdom. And so he says, okay. But then shortly after that, Norway loses a war to Denmark, and Denmark takes Iceland as one of its prizes for the war. And then Denmark just keeps Iceland under its thumb for like all the way into the 20th century. They have a trade monopoly where only one company can, I mean, this is pretty typical colonial stuff. One company can trade with Iceland, and they send one ship with rotted grain every year up to Iceland, and then they take away all the nice, fish and wool products and everything that they can get. So that's kind of so there's just long, dark, hundreds of years where people are living in sod houses and without a lot to eat. And there's a huge eruption in 1783 where a fissure opens in the ground. It's 20 kilometers long, and it just puts up so much stuff into the atmosphere that the Mississippi River freezes. Europe loses 2 summers, so there's no food grown here. And so that causes the French Revolution. That's like another story. But then in Iceland, it kills like, like 10% or 20% of the people and like 90% of the animals. So Iceland really, gets decimated again. It's a harsh place. And finally, in 1918, there's a movement. In 1918, Iceland declares home rule from Denmark, and they agree that they will talk about it again. I think in 1938, or late 30s. But anyway, at that point, Denmark is occupied by the Nazis, by the Germans, and so Iceland just declares independence in 1944, and the United States says great, because they need a Cold War base there. So they say recognized, and then other countries follow. And so Iceland it's young in the sense that it's really been independent since 1944, but it's also very old and very proud because of the old stories. Okay, that's probably enough history, unless you have any questions on history.
Where was the first settler coming from?
Oh, I should have said that. So the settlement was driven by Norwegians who were wealthy land owners there, and Norway was being united as a kingdom, like King Harald the Fair-Haired. And these guys, some of them didn't want to come under this king, so they sailed west for free land. But the first person who sailed there from Norway, he hated it. He got stuck there in the winter, and so he came back and he said, there's just this horrible place, it's a land of ice, we should never go there. And then a couple of years later, it was like some people were angry enough with the Norwegian king that they left, and some of them took, in the DNA now you can see that it's true that they went and took like Irish slaves, so they went and abducted Irish people to take them to work in Iceland. So, okay. So that's yes.
Okay. One of the most fascinating things in the book was that you mentioned that there's relatively little history of money as such, as an object that governs exchange of value and whatnot. So was there only barter in all those years inside the Icelandic economy, or?
Yeah, I believe so. And the idea, something I learned when I was living there was that the idea of having cash in your wallet was like in the last generation or two pretty new. So my father-in-law talks about how he grew up as a teenager. He went in the summers to a farm in the north, which was a dairy farm, and that dairy farm was like 60 kilometers from the nearest town, because Iceland is big.
Yeah.
And they didn't have any real communication with the outside world except this truck that came for milk every 3 days and took the milk from the dairy farm away.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me very proudly that if they needed anything on the farm, like a new shovel or some tool, they would just put a note on the milk tankard, and then the dairy would send back the thing. And it was just taken off the value of the milk. So they were, it wasn't like they were just, and this would have been in the 1960s. So it was not that long ago. And yeah. So maybe we could go to the next one. Oh yeah, so here's a nice Swiss-Iceland comparison. This is a rough size comparison that I put together here. These numbers are probably a few years old, but about 8 million here, about 350,000 in Iceland. So if you know the Canton Vallis, that's Iceland in terms of the population and the size of the economy is about the size of Vallis. So although Iceland's much bigger than Switzerland, most people live here in Reykjavik, and that's it. Then there's a few other towns around and farms and so on. It used to be that there were no cities at all, and everyone lived on little farms all around the coast. Okay. Yep. Okay. So the boom. There's a boom, a volcano. So I'll talk a little bit about the economic boom and how that got going. So maybe to the next one. Okay. So yeah, this guy is behind a lot of Icelandic recent history. This is David Odson. He's kind of an amazing, I think he's kind of like the Boris Johnson of Iceland in a way. That's fair, right? He's kind of an amazing political creature. And he was very young. He was the mayor of Reykjavik. And being mayor of Reykjavik is already big because Reykjavik is kind of the only game in the country. So if you're the mayor, that's pretty powerful. He went from there, I think, almost straight into being prime minister in the 90s. He was prime minister for a long time. Then there was a deal with another party where he stepped back and he became the foreign minister, but he was still pulling the strings. That was after I was there, 2005, I think, 6. And then he said, I'm retired from politics. And they said, okay, well, as your retirement gift, you can be the head of the central bank. And he said, great, he took that. He was the head of the central bank during the crisis. And then he was forced out, as you'll see, and then he became the editor of the most prominent newspaper. And I believe he still is today, right? Yeah. Okay. So his government said, Reagan, Thatcher did such a great thing, we're going to privatize our banks and other things. They privatized not just the banks, but other aspects of the economy. And that was between 98 and 2003. But it's come out recently that these privatizations weren't really done, they weren't transparent. And it seems like 2 of the 3 banks, for example, were more or less allocated to the 2 powerful political parties. And so there was other, they think for Landsbanki, which was the oldest bank, that there was outside interest from like a Nordic bank. But I think that was never seriously considered. So when they were privatizing them. The other thing he did is he floated the currency on world currency markets. And the currency had never been tradable before. And the currency was always high inflation. So it used to be 1 ISK for 1 Danish kroner in 1918, I think. And then now it's, do you know?
No, I can stay done.
It's like, I don't even know. Maybe it's 30 to 1 now, but that's because, but they chopped off zeros many times. So it's like, I don't know. I don't want to say, it was like maybe 300,000 to 1 or something. It's or 30,000. It's gone a lot off kilter. And so because it's high inflation, that means that you have to pay high yields over time. And so the government bond yields could sometimes be 8 or 10% even. When David Odson privatized the banks, he also floated the currency, so anybody could buy it. So if you're a Swiss bank and you want to trade ISK, and you can buy as much as you like. So the ISK was very attractive because the Icelandic government bonds paid such high yields. Someone in a low yield country like here or Japan or even the US in those years, they wanted, they said, pick up some yield, we'll just buy ISK, we'll buy government bonds. And so a lot of money came into the country on this carry trade. And that helped these banks, which were newly privatized, that helped them grow very fast. I like to say that the Germans never met a loan they didn't want to give. Are we allowed to say that? And then they like to blame people when they can't pay off the loan, like the Greeks. But anyway, the Deutsche Bank and other German banks, Landesbanks, they lent these banks a lot, at least for a couple of years, in order to grow on the wholesale debt markets. And they grew very fast. Koiping, the largest bank, it grew 500% in 3 years. And they bragged about this. They're like, we're doubling our balance sheet every year. And the stock market grew 330% from 2004 to 2007. So that's like 50-60% annual returns.
And how big was how many companies were there listed?
Well, the big index was called the ICE 15.
Okay.
That was the 15 biggest. And then there was a few others. My favorite one is called Slaughterfjällag Suderlands, which means the slaughtering company of the Southlands. And they make hot dogs, and I mean it's a meat processing company. They were not in the ICE 15. They were not prestigious enough to be. But those banks actually, they were growing so fast that they crowded out the everything else on the market. So by 2008, the banks were about 3/4 of the market index. Yes?
So what about the wages? Did they grow as fast, or did people get poorer and poorer?
No, if you were in a bank in those days.
Yeah, obviously. Sure.
But the thing is, the banks grew so fast. Like I was one of those people. I came to Iceland in 2004. I was working in a software company supporting banks, and by 2007 I had started in a bank, and maybe my salary went up 50% or something.
Mhm.
But then later I found that I was getting completely screwed because I was a foreigner, so it probably could have been double that. But
Ah.
anyway, the banks kind of not only did they crowd out the market, but they kind of sucked all the talents, all the new graduates who had been studying engineering. They switched their major to financial engineering, and they went and worked in the banks. So the banks I think they had almost 10,000 employees by the crash, and the country only has 300. They had 300, only 300 at that time, maybe ish. So the banks were just giant compared to the rest of the economy. And yeah, then we saw all the typical things you see with a boom. This huge real estate bubble. Everyone starts driving Range Rovers. I mean, I mean, we didn't drive Range Rovers, but there were a lot of Range Rovers. And then there was a lot of private jets going over, which was crazy because I was born in Boston. I maybe saw a private jet on the tarmac of the airport when I was flying somewhere, but I never saw them just going over. But in Reykjavik, at the domestic airport, you'd see them like a few times a day sometimes, just going over my neighborhood. It's like, what's going on here? It was just, it was almost like being in a movie for a couple of years. Okay, so any questions on the boom? Yeah, I think I need to pick up the pace because we have a lot to cover. Okay, then what happened in 2006 on my birthday was that this report came out. And this was when credit analysts from, these guys are in London, there were some at Danske Bank as well, they started to take a look at the Icelandic banks a couple of years into their growth. And they said really strong language, like, we are only at the beginning of their problems, they said. And they talked about how these banks, they borrowed so much that just in the next, so they say here, these banks have to pay back 1.3 times the size of the economy of Iceland just through to the next year. They need to roll this debt. And so they were worried about that. And then came this famous, if you go to the next one, this picture was in there, and when I was new in Iceland, maybe I'd been there a year and a half, and I saw this picture and I was like, jeez. Because this was the interconnections between the banks in 2006. And Merrill Lynch, I think, correctly raised questions about the cross-shareholding between the banks. And another thing here you'll see is that there's not a lot of, if you look at the kind of who owns the banks, you won't see a lot of names you recognize. There's no Vanguard or BlackRock or, you know, you don't see anything it's like, oh, what's Exista BV, what's, you know, what's Milestone and so on. So, next one, unless you have questions about this. I put this slide in for a university. They wanted to know about the dangers of cross-shareholding. Yeah, it's not great, but you have this. There's a lot of problems with it. I guess we could skip that one. Okay, so that was the mini crisis, March 2006. Those reports come out. There's a little bit of buzz in the investing world in New York, London, so on, that Iceland is kind of strange, what's going on in Iceland. And the stock market immediately crashes about 20%. The currency, which had been going up, as the carry trade, that's the other thing. Our salaries maybe stayed the same, even if you stayed in the same job, but the value of the currency against like the dollar or the euro was going up every month. And you could look and be like, whoa, I'm 5% richer. Like, it was amazing. And people went, there's a piece in the book about people flying to Boston just for the weekend, just to buy some clothes. Because you could save enough on, you know, you could save enough on a laptop to pay for the trip to Boston, or something like that. So, and I actually saw a man, he had bought 4 tires for like a truck, and he had wheeled them into Boston, in the airport, and they just put like a sticker around it, like it was a suitcase, and they just put it on. So it was crazy. Okay, so, and the Germans in March 2006 also said, hey, what's going on? And they pulled back. So it was harder for the banks to borrow. And that would have been a time to maybe take pause and look at things. But the banks by this point, I think they had no choice, as you'll see when we get into this, but to keep growing. It was just Ponzi mathematics by this point, and they had to keep going. So they continued to grow. They got money by opening online savings accounts using the nice EU passport scheme. They were able to open savings accounts in the UK, Netherlands, and they even came to Switzerland by the end. And they grew to be 11 times the size of the country's economy. And then they all crashed on a Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday in October 2008. Yeah.
What about the Wednesday?
The Wednesday was the day that we thought maybe it's going to be okay. Maybe the last bank will hold.
Yeah.
But inside the last bank, they were like, let's get this money out to Luxembourg again, and so on. And they were just setting things up so that they could also crash. But we didn't know that out. I mean, I went to some friends' houses, some friend's house on Tuesday night, and we were just like, maybe Kuipfing can hold on. If they can hold on, we can maybe be okay. Yeah, those were dark. This was dark times when this happened. The British government briefly labeled Iceland itself as a terrorist organization. Also labeled the banks as terrorist organizations. And what that did is, they did that to freeze. They did that for, like, Gordon Brown did this, like, I think for a soundbite, really, because he could look tough. And Alistair Darling, they could look tough. But this killed the country. This was like what's happening in Russia now with the free. There was about 10 weeks where there was no money moving in and out of the country at all, and that meant like couldn't import anything. Companies were going bust. Fishing companies that had exported fish to the European mainland were not getting paid for it, and yeah, it was bad news.
This was Northern Rock went bust in 2007, right? So
Right.
there was already banking trouble in the UK, so they probably were afraid.
Yeah, and
of
they.
changing.
There's a famous, they made so Kuipfing, the biggest Icelandic bank, had a separate UK entity that was a separate bank in the UK. And the UK came up with a banking rescue package that every UK bank was eligible for. And so the Icelandic bank said, hey, to the head of the FSA, I think it was Hector Sands at the time, they said, hey, what about us? And he said, these funds are not for you. So they just let them. That's another long story there, but I guess we can keep going.
I have a question.
Yes.
I mean, October 2008 was also a dark period for the world economy, not only for Iceland.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So,
Lehman was
so
up to September.
what's the, it was September, I think.
What's the connection?
What's the connection?
Well, the Lehman was the final trigger because the banks were probably insolvent and in trouble for at least several years before. But after Lehman happened, it really brought Iceland down because then all the credit markets in the world interbank lending started to really freeze. And these guys needed even short-term credit to roll their debts and stuff. And so that was the final nail in the coffin. But they had been able to escape many other things before, and you'll see part of it when we get into the scam behind this. You'll see how they were able to deceive. I did this article in, I don't know what year that was, 2010 maybe? This is a younger me. I was trying to show how big the collapse of the Icelandic banks were, and so I put them up against the biggest American collapses at the time, yeah, at least in the US. And so you see here Enron way down the list. So the three Icelandic banks together are almost the size of 3 Enrons in a country with hardly any people. Individually, General Motors, click thing, I mean, it's even individually they're huge bankruptcies. Now you can say this is a little bit cheeky because you're comparing financial firms which are bigger to non-financial. Okay, fine, but they're huge. And I say here you would have needed 140 Northern Rocks in the UK to equal what happened to us in Iceland. Or I also say you would have needed 300 Lehman Brothers in the US. Because relative, yeah. Oh yeah, so here's just how the market looked. This is the period of the privatization. You can see there was a little dot-com bubble here where it goes from 1,000 to almost 2,000, so that's pretty big, a dot-com thing. But then you can see a much bigger ramp up as things kick off. So here's the floating of the currency, and then you get to this period where you have 330% growth in the stock market, and then you have this mini crisis in 2006, and then I'm going to pick on someone. What's strange about this picture? Anything?
The optimism in 2006,
Seven?
yeah, 7.
And
yeah.
7, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in 2007, because remember this is the Icelandic market index, but it's really the 3 banks almost entirely. So yes, you're right. I mean, 2007 was already a bad time for banks, but somehow it's still going up. I was also meaning this. There's a straight line down.
Well,
So there was one day where we thought, this is when we were thinking like maybe Kaupthing can hold on. Because there was one day where the banks still had as much value as they had. Okay, they'd lost a lot, but they still had as much as maybe 2005 or 6. Still looked like, okay, but there's something there. And then the market in 2008, the market lost 97% of its time. Yeah. And normally, when a single entity is in trouble, you don't get a straight line on the last day. People are talking. If you look at Lehman Brothers, for example, it loses a lot of value over 2 years, and then it only
fixed
drops.
positions, yeah.
Yes.
What percentage of the retail population held the stocks?
Through our legally mandated pension funds, 100%.
No.
Separately, a lot of people, like my mother-in-law, had investment in Landsbanki. She had worked there for years. She was proud of Landsbanki. She had a lot of her own retirement savings in shares. I think some of the banks, I want to say Kaupthing, the biggest one, had 30,000 shareholders in Iceland. It's quite a number of people had some shares. People loved these shares. I mean, during this run-up, you could get in a taxi and the guy wanted to talk to you about how how the banks were doing. I mean, everybody was in it. It was, you know, it was the pride of the country.
It's very fast from barter system to be cash.
Yeah.
If you look at the history,
Yeah,
in 1960 nobody was carrying cash, and then
yeah.
the speed at which
Yeah.
this.
So maybe we go to the next one. Okay, so now I want to get to the. That was all just a prelude. Now I want to get to the fun part. The fun part is okay. Just a personal story. I worked in one of disclaimer. I worked in the asset management arm of Landsbanki, which was called Landsvaki. I worked there for almost 2 years. I started in 2007, January, and I had increasingly sleepless nights working there. I didn't like some of the things we were doing, and I quit in October 2008. So my last day was the 3rd of October.
So the weekend before?
Yes, the weekend before.
You caused the crash.
I was almost stuck in there, but my boss didn't want to. He was playing some tricks. They always tried to play tricks on foreigners. So he was playing some tricks where he wanted me to take vacation instead of paying me for the vacation. So he was trying to get me to take a vacation, which wasn't legal. But in Iceland, I never, because I grew up in America, we have great unions. So the union lawyer just called him up and said, no, you know, and it was, anyway. So he was playing some games with me, and then the admin assistant for our department, she just brought in cakes on the 3rd of October. And that signaled that it was my last day. Because once there was cakes there, they couldn't keep me anymore. And then they had to come over and she was brilliant. They had to come over and shake my hand and let me go. But then the bank collapsed on Monday or Tuesday, the next week. And so then I had no job, and it was no hope of a job. Because I thought I was going to go waltz into one of the pension funds and get a job. That wasn't going to happen. I mean, the unemployment went up 400, 500% in a short time, and yeah, it was hard. And then our we ended up losing our house, but that didn't happen for about a year or two. But a lot of our money, which was in a money market fund, was frozen, so we couldn't even get to our savings. I applied like 200 people. We all applied to be investigators at the market regulator, and I was really lucky because they hired me. And then they decided to hire one other guy, so they hired 2 people.
Oh. That was you and another guy.
Yeah, and then then 6 months after the crash, almost to the day, I come in early April 2009, and they were like, "Oh, so here's your desk, and you have your computer, your telephone," and they were like, "Go investigate the crisis."
Good luck.
And then people would come over. This is the great thing in Icelandic. If you start a new job, people will come and introduce themselves, and then they'll ask you, "No att gera?" You know this one? Like, do you have enough to do? And I was, yeah. And they'd, "Oh, that's good," and they'd walk away. But actually, I had no idea what to do. So maybe you can go to the next one. So I had no idea what to do, but I got lucky again because a lawyer on my new team comes over to me with a letter, and it's a letter from the stock exchange, and he says, "We don't know what to do with this. Maybe you know something about trading and so on." I said, "Yeah," because I had been I worked in Wall Street for the back office of a big bank for about 5 years as an IT person, so I knew how to build an IT system to settle trades. So I knew a lot about trades, at least back office side, and I knew how to look at trading data. So he said, "Maybe you can look at this." And so what the letter said was that there was 3 days before the banks all crashed, where it looked like one trader at each bank had bought all the shares on the market. All, or nearly all, 90, 80, 90, 100%. So it was, any seller would come to the exchange. Here's the exchange. Proprietary trader would be on the buying side. So all the market volume of those 3 days was the banks themselves. It looked like, And they said, but we don't really know, we can just see the trader ID, and you know, we don't know for sure that this trader ID is a proprietary trader, we don't know for sure that he used the bank's own money, but it looks like it, blah, blah, blah. So that was the letter. It was just like, I think 2 A4 pages stapled in, it was not much. They had a couple of charts on there, and I just thought, wow, this is crazy, like how can these guys, you know, they never announced like a share buyback, it was just, they were just going in and buying their, intervening in their own market, really. So I wanted to look at the data. I studied engineering, so I like data. So I was like, oh, how can I see these trading data? I went to my boss, and she said, well, just call the exchange, and they'll send it to you. So they did. They sent it to me in like an hour. I had an Excel spreadsheet with all those trades, and it was like they said, it was the one trader ID almost exclusively on the buy side, and then the seller could be anybody from another brokerage or bank. So, but it was just those 3 days, and I thought, well, this could be a good case, you know, this could be my first case. So, and actually it was each of the 3 banks. I was, you know, so we can just write this up, you know, but I just want to see, like, is it just these 3 days, or did it start before? Maybe they did it the day before too, and they, you know. So I called the exchange again, and I said, we'd like 2 weeks of trading data, please. And they said, sure. They sent it over, but it was the same for the 2 weeks. So it wasn't just 3 days, but it was 2 weeks. And I was like, whoa, okay. So I need to go back a little more. So I went back a month. So then it was back because I thought maybe it started with Lehman. Maybe that triggered them to do this stuff. So I went back pre-Lehman to see what that looked like, and it was nearly the same. And so then I thought I was being really bold, and I went back 6 months. So April 2008, I think, to October, to the crash. Any guesses? Same thing. So I was like, now we have a 6 month, now we know that for 6 months, these market prices are just kind of invented by the 3 banks for half of a year. This is crazy. So I wanted to see when it really began. So then they were sending me just Excel spreadsheets with every trade. And so I went back 5 years. And then I could see that there was a time when it seemed to really start in the summer of 2004, which is coincidentally around the time I moved to Iceland. It was around the beginning of this manipulation. Yeah.
Okay.
So those years that I've been living there, and we've been talking about the market and 50-60% a year and stuff, every time the price dropped, the banks would run in and support it until it turned around again. And they were always in there. There was not 1 month where they were not in there. They were always in there, not always buying 100%, but always buying something.
Okay.
So maybe go to the, yeah?
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
If you received this letter and they did the same thing for, you said, more than 6 months, why no one received the letter before?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't answer. It's a good question.
Because things were going well. And
Yeah, things are going well. Yeah, yeah. Why?
Why write the letter?
So this is what I'm showing you here. Took us a few months at least to put the puzzle together, but what we uncovered was a sort of a conveyor belt for bank shares. It was a one-way street where anyone who came to the stock exchange to sell, of course, anybody who came to buy, they wouldn't have let them buy, but there weren't that many buyers. But there was more sellers at those prices. Now, we'll never know. Maybe if the banks had just been 20% cheaper, there would have been everyone in the world coming in and buying. But we'll never know because they wouldn't let it. They wouldn't let the market clear. They intervened, and they spent a lot. So they each spent around 1 billion Swiss francs, just in this tiny market in Iceland that you never heard of until today. They spent about 1 billion francs in the last year of the bank's lives, each bank. Because in that, like you said, 2007 was a hard time for banks. And so that was when they really had to come in hard. And so a big mystery for us when we were investigating was, yeah, but what happened to the shares? Because they accumulated sometimes in one financial quarter, like 20% of all the shares outstanding came through the exchange and onto their proprietary books, and they were sitting there. So I got eventually the books of the proprietary desk, and sure enough, they were there. That matched the exchange records. And then what would happen is at the end of the quarter, they would go across in a big block or a few big trades. The brokerage desk would buy them, and then on the last day of the financial quarter, the brokerage desk would sell them to a VIP. And increasingly, these became offshore companies, mostly in the British Virgin Islands, but also other places. Also in Iceland, they had operating and domiciliary companies holding shares, also Luxembourg, also Cyprus. Also some bank employees became VIPs. So,
Without knowing that they were VIP?
no, they were given grants,
Okay.
and given big grants of shares.
Nice.
But they were also, so now I'm getting to, so how does a bank, so if I granted you, Boris, 2 million francs worth of bank shares, how are you going to pay for that?
The loan from the bank?
Yes! It's easy, right? I mean, it's also a thing. Yeah, so the banks just made loans, 100% loans for these shares.
Is it legal at 100%?
What's that?
No, is it legal 100% loan for share? Or because
No.
you're VIP, it is. It becomes.
Well, no.
Right, because there's no change as beneficial owner, really, right?
Right.
If you, the seller, grants a loan to the buyer,
Yeah.
you're basically still on the hook.
They were still on the hook, but the auditors let them keep that then off their balance sheet. They didn't.
Do
They
you
didn't
have
look
a kind of FINMA in Iceland so they can
That's-
check it?
That's who
from
I was.
time to
That's
time?
who I was working for. But I was new there, and I was not popular with some people because I was looking into those things.
I see.
But we made many cases around the trading here, and then separate cases around the granting of loans. Some of those loans would be for like 200 or 300 million francs at once.
Wow.
This was huge business, and it got worse and worse the more they had to. The volumes got bigger and bigger every quarter as they had to become a bigger and bigger piece of their own market. And then they had bigger and bigger, just like with Enron, they had bigger and bigger problems at the end of each quarter to dump those things. And the bank's entire business model kind of became buying and hiding its own shares. So my personal angle on this is that I was a bank employee at the end of 2007. We were looking to buy a bigger house. I thought it would be no problem to get, and we didn't need that much of a, we needed a little extension on our mortgage to afford the bigger place. But not that, I'm glad that they denied it. And I was a bank employee, they wouldn't even let me borrow a few thousand extra. Because at that point, all the credit was being diverted into stuff like this.
But the banks were behind operating and domiciliary companies then?
They would establish them, and they would put like, if you were a client,
Yeah.
they'd ask you, hey, we want to make you a new company, and we'll loan you all the money that you need, and you're going to buy our shares. If the shares go up, you make that pure profit against the loan. If they don't, you could walk away. And so that was the deal that a lot of these VIP clients had, and also some bank employees had this deal.
Was there any effects on the companies that were traded on the stock exchange? I can't really realize, I have this big company that provides services to in Iceland, and then I issue shares, and then all those shares are bought by the banks. And is there any
Oh, you mean for other companies that aren't the banks?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. But what I think is that they were crowded out in general. There was almost, the whole market became dominated by those banks, and then some of the other companies you saw in the other picture that were around them, they also issued shares, and their shares were also traded in this way. So, yeah, so that's the main. That's the main. This is, I call it share laundering. To me, that was the bedrock of how the banks were able to keep growing and keep going for at least a few years, and then when they collapsed, really to take down the country, because they never, the market price for them was never representing real demand, supply demand on the market.
The three banks were using exactly the same system,
More or less,
and they spent each 1 billion.
about
Just in the last year.
just in the last 11
In
months.
the last year.
Yeah.
So it was fully coordinated between the three banks. They, or what?
No, but I learned a lot from this. And one of the things I learned is you don't need a conspiracy of people sitting around in a room to do something like this. What you need is incentives. Late in the game, they did coordinate. So there was some trading, like in September 2008, where Glitnir and Landsbanki, the second and third biggest banks, they swapped shares onto each other's books to help each other out. But for years, this thing ran smoothly, and the market works, right? So if one bank is manipulating its own shares, the others have to, or they're going to lose, and everyone's going to wonder why their performance is worse. So I didn't see a lot of. I mean, of course, these guys could have been calling or talking at a bar or something, but I don't think you need that in a small market like this. The incentives are enough to keep. There's another angle to this, which is that the biggest bank had a listing in Sweden and Iceland, and they had two traders, and one was kind of in charge of the Icelandic market, and one was in charge of the Stockholm share price. And they had to. They had to arbitrage. They had to do the same level of buying in both markets at the same time, so that the price would be matched. And there's a famous, this came out in the court documents, there's a time when one of the traders overslept. He needed to be at work at 7:30 or 8 or something in the morning in the summer to get the Stockholm Open. And he missed the Stockholm Open. And it starts to drop. And I think it was the CEO of the bank, not the top CEO, but the CEO of the Icelandic business unit, called him on his mobile and said, where are you? You need to get in here, Stockholm screen. He's like, I'm on my way, there was a lot of evidence in the emails and in phone calls and so on that the prosecutor was able to use to show this is pretty well coordinated, unfortunately. But, oh yeah, and the other thing that came out in the court documents, when you have two traders, you can see, they printed these long lists in the indictments of like each trader's ID and how many shares he bought that day, or what percentage of the market's shares he bought that day, and it goes down, like these lists go over the last 11 months, and you can see when the traders took vacations, because you can see when it just drops to zero, and this guy over here is covering the buying, and then, so it was really a machine that needed to be kept running every day. So maybe go to,
And maybe a quick question on because in the book you talk about them even manipulating the credit default swap markets.
Yeah.
That was towards the tail end when the wheels started coming off? Or?
Yeah, that was, I have some slides about that, but I don't think we'll have time for that. But,
Oh, okay.
maybe we can talk after,
Yeah.
or I'm almost out of time, right?
All depends on the audience.
I think we can skip that one
Okay.
for now. Okay, this is interesting for the first two parts. Someone mentioned when you buy the shares against the loan, you mentioned it, when you buy the shares against the loan, it's not really a transfer of ownership. So in European securities law, which is also Icelandic law, that's called a fictive trade, where the base owner never changes hands. But there's also a market manipulation through real trades, which is when they go on the exchange, and they actually spent $1 billion on the exchange, keeping the price from dropping. And so they were charged in the market abuse cases, they were charged, I believe in all three banks, at least Kuiping were charged with both of these two kinds of market abuse. They were not charged with this, I don't think, which is releasing a rumor. But the first two, yeah. Well, let's see what we have next. Okay, yeah, so this was a long time ago now, almost 10 years, but 9 people were charged in the biggest bank, which is Kuiping. And the prosecutor kept himself, this is why I keep talking about 11 months, he kept himself to this period, which was the worst period, from beginning of November 2007 until the crash. And like I said, yeah, there was two types of market abuse plus something called umboðssvik in Icelandic, which is like agency fraud or breach of trust. So these guys were entrusted by the shareholders to do X and they broke the trust. But it's funny because like increasingly the bank was its own shareholder. I mean, it was the pensions that got killed on this because they, if you look at the trading data, the only legitimate buyers almost are them. Because they have to, by Icelandic law, I think they have to hold 40 or 50% in equities. And they're capped, I think only 10% of their investments could be outside of Iceland at all. So they're basically holding government bonds in Iceland and Icelandic equities. So they were forced to buy these bank shares by law. And so they did right up until the end. Next one. Oh yeah, this is just some data on real trades. You can see some months. In September 2008, Kuiping bought 61% of all the exchange volume for the month in itself. August was even worse, 67%. 20 days in this period where they bought over 75% of the market, and they were 35% of the market.
But that showed up after your search. After
Yeah, nobody knew this, of course. This was a big. That's why I call it the world's biggest con, because people of Iceland, we had no idea.
Yeah.
Now, some of these traders' defenses in court were that everybody knew. And one guy who came in to one of the banks in 2003 as a proprietary trader, his defense was that this was going on since 1998 when the bank first started trading. So actually, when I was finalizing the book, I came across even more evidence from court documents that a lot of people just came out in court and said, no, this started in 98. This didn't start in 2004. Like, these guys don't know what they're talking about. We were doing this for years, you know. Like, so I'm not guilty because it was already happening, basically. Yeah. What's next? Oh yeah, you know how an order book looks probably? I took this off of some Bitcoin thing or something. I don't remember what this was, but you have all the bids, people who want to buy, and the asks, people who want to sell. What the proprietary desks would do was, and what he missed doing when he came in too late to manipulate the Swedish market in the morning, was they would layer in all these trades. So they wouldn't just put in a bid at the last price, but they would build, because there were nobody else in there. So they would come in and build a pyramid, build a book on the exchange, typing in all these trades, so that when other participants came, they would see a nice deep order book. Yeah. And what they would often do is at the inside price, they would put what's called an iceberg. Yeah. And so they would put a huge iceberg. It would be buy 5 million shares or whatever the number was, but show 50,000, or, you know. And so that iceberg, if you look at the exchange trading data, you'll see that over the day the price doesn't move, because it just stays at whatever that iceberg is for the whole day, unless someone goes to lunch and then there's a big trade or something, and the price drops and you see them come in. I mean, it's crazy, but okay. What else do we have? Yeah, just so now you can maybe see why there was a sharp drop at the end, because the market. Yeah.
Did anybody benefit from shorting the market?
It was very hard to short because nobody would lend the shares.
Yeah.
They didn't believe in it. So I talked to a pension fund guy in 2008. This is before the crash, and because the pension funds were some of my clients when I was at Landsbanki, and he said, no way, I'm lending these shares out. Let someone short this, and I was like, yeah, but you make money on it. It's good for you have a fiduciary duty to the pension,
Maximize return.
you know, so you should lend it out if someone wants to borrow it and pay you a nice fee. He said, no way, I'm not doing that.
None of the insiders also.
What's that?
None of the insiders in the bank who knew about this Ponzi scheme, they also never shorted, tried to.
No, but what they did do is often as soon as, if their stock options vested, they would cash it out and turn it into cash as soon as they could. Yeah.
That's a pretty good sign.
Yeah. These are just, we can skip this, but these are some of the companies that were in the indictment, so, of Quick Thing. So, you get an idea. Holt Investment bought $250 million worth of shares versus 100% loan in just a few trades in just a few months, and so on. So, you know, and if the bank really had a new investor coming in with $250 million, I mean, you'd think they'd want to put that out on the PR newswire and have like an FT story about it or something. But of course they didn't. This was all done under. Okay, what else do we have? Oh yeah, we can skip this. This is Reagan Gorbachev.
86, right?
Yeah, I want. This is the house where they met, and you can see it here reflected in the windows of Quick Thing. They built their headquarters right at that house, which is kind of like a sacred place in Reykjavik, and they were like, so positionally, they were kind of the soul of the nation in a way. Like they were right there. Yeah, we can skip that one. These just shows you everyone in red was at the biggest bank was both charged and convicted in that case.
Not the CFO. Not the CFO.
No, she got away. She always got away. She's really good. And she was, I don't remember the case, but there was a case, remember this entity's 30% bigger than Enron. And there was a case, it was something with derivatives agreements, or don't quote me, but there was one case where she was up, and the judge said, no, there's no way she could have understood these complex agreements or something like that. And she was like the CFO of a huge, yeah. So.
Is Iceland the only country where somebody went to jail during the GFC?
I mean, there was a couple in the U.S., like one guy, I think, right? Some low-level
They
people.
suffered enough.
What's that?
They suffered enough.
Yeah.
Not to
True.
go to jail.
What else do we have? Oh yeah, this is just all of the 9 were convicted of different things. Some of them got 0 prison time, and some got 4.5 years in practice. And not all served. Not all showed up to serve.
It was optional.
Well, you know, you can kind of delay. One CEO delayed it until he got a new trial, and the details are all in the book, but he basically never served. And others that did serve, I don't believe was that long, maybe a year, and then they were out. So,
It was optional
yeah, this is just a nice quote from this book, Fishing for Fools. If you own a solvent firm, you don't want to take money out of the firm because you want the money to keep being in the firm, working and producing return. But if you know your firm is bankrupt, your incentive is to take out as much as you can, which we saw a lot of that. So your incentive is like Genghis Khan's army, just looting, just take as much out as you can before the party is up. Yeah. I think that's it. Yeah. So the book, here's the book. There's a lot more. This is maybe one chapter. I don't know. This is like 2 chapters, maybe what we talked about. So there's more insider trading. There's some crazy thing called the Lindsay affair, which I still think about sometimes. Yeah. So.
There's some interesting data on how mortgages work in Iceland, which was a shock to me.
Oh yeah.
They're inflation indexed.
Yes.
Is that why you lost your house? Because
Yes.
the mortgage payment just kept going up?
Yeah, the mortgage payment goes up, and I think ours ended up, if we put it in Swiss terms, maybe the house was worth 350,000 francs, 200,000, something like that. And then through the crash, the mortgage balance went up to 400. But the house was still like the same house.
So the monthly payment just kept going.
So the monthly payment is, it's calculated, it's recalculated every month on some formula, and so the inflation feeds through. So they have built, and nobody in Iceland would listen when I said this, but they have built like a forward feedback loop into inflation. Because everybody's,
Like a doomsday machine, basically.
yeah, it's a doomsday machine, yeah, everybody's mortgage and a lot of corporate debt and a lot of automobile debt and so on is inflation indexed. And so, and the unions are strong, as we said, so you get this pressure on your monthly expenses, and you never have enough money in Iceland. It's as expensive as Switzerland, but you maybe have like a Spanish salary or something. So you have this tremendous pressure on your monthly expenses with your mortgage mainly, and then your union goes and asks for a big raise and gets it, and
It just feeds on
it's a
itself.
doomsday machine. Yeah. Yeah. So.
So would you prefer to do questions just on the breakout, or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so should I, so we have Jared's book available for everyone if you'd like.
Cool.
I'll bring it out.
Yeah, you get a free copy.
Nice.
You got ours.
You can get another one.
Well, good, I don't know what it says.
I mean, if you have other questions, just.
I have another question.
Yes.
Except for the Merrill Lynch report in 2006.
Yes.
There must have been such a big, you know,
There-
such a, if the,
Maybe I'll sit back there
Yeah.
at the desk.
Oh, okay, perfect.
if the vote Cotonadu Valley, because you compare it to Valley, the size of the economy,
Yes.
where trading so much money, somebody would raise it, a few people would raise their eyebrows. How come it didn't happen earlier?
Well, the IMF did a big report in 2006 also, and said very strong language about Iceland, and also Danske Bank did,
Okay.
and there was, and I think there was one more bank at least that did, plus the IMF. All that came out in 2006. That was really the,
Okay.
but the language in the IMF report, it doesn't translate that well into Iceland. It's kind of like we have concern, you know, like when a British person says we have concerns, it means you're dead. It's over. So there was this famous call with Alistair Darling and what's his name, Arnie Mathiesen, wasn't it? Arnie, the finance minister.
Yeah.
The finance minister was a veterinarian who became finance minister, and
This is
he had a call directly with Darling with no interpreter, because he's like, well, I speak English. And Darling was like, well, we're seriously concerned or something, and this guy's like, okay, well, I'll call you in the morning. You know, it's like, it's really like clash of worlds. And so the IMF, yeah, they had strong language. If you read it, even the Merrill Lynch language is like, the problems are just beginning for the Icelandic banks. I mean, that's pretty strong. But it was kind of like, yeah, these guys don't know what.
What is going on?
It's
You know,
different. It's different here.
It's different here. There was a lot of that, and the president of Iceland was at the time was flown to Davos and other places by business people. The business guys had a lot of money. They had private jets and so on, so they would fly him, and he was an ambassador for the country, and he would talk about how Iceland had solved finance and so on. So there, and even in 2008, Þorgerður Katrín Gunnarsdóttir, I think she was at that time the Minister of Education. And do you remember this one, Keith? When in 2008 things were pretty bad in the world, and there was a lot of questions. Someone asked about the CDS spreads. I think it was the CDS spreads of the Icelandic banks, which by then were like 1,000 points or 800 points. I mean, they were crazy. And she was asked about, don't quote me, I think she was asked about the health of the Icelandic banks. Some question around this, or the health of the economy. And they said, you know, so-and-so in Germany or so-and-so in Denmark says you need to be concerned about this. And she said, like, maybe they need some endowment, like maybe they need some continuing education, those people. She was the education, and she was just, They were very flippant about it. Also, David Odson, the puppet master, you know, the politician, he was asked in the summer or a couple months before the crisis. Then the currency had been dropping pretty steadily for a few months. And he was asked about that. He was walking to his car outside the central bank, and they got him on the camera. And he was just like, currencies go up, currencies go down, who can say? You know, something like that. Don't quote me, but something around those, you know, very, very kind of, and I was like, at the time I was shocked because I knew central bank governors don't just say stuff on the way to the car, you know. So, yeah. One final thing I forgot to say. I don't want to pick on Iceland. I'm an Icelander. I love Iceland. And I wrote the book because I think this is a much bigger story than Iceland. It's a fun story when you read about Iceland, but everyone who reads the book, they bring to it their own, it's like a mirror. So I had a banker in Zurich, senior person at one of the biggest Swiss banks, told me that I was writing about Switzerland. And I had crypto guys say, oh, you're writing about the crypto markets. And everyone kind of brings their own story to this story. I think it's...
Does it reflect that it happens everywhere but at a smaller scale?
Hmm?
If you say that everyone mirrors it onto the book, does
I,
it mean?
I don't mean that every country's banks are buying their own shares every day, but one journalist told me, he said, your book was frightening because I could see that what happened in Iceland was easy for you to uncover because it was a simple and small society. But he said, and this guy was American, he said, now I know that something like this is happening here, but we'll never uncover it. You know, so.
I guess it's about incentives and
Yeah.
the ability of people to
Yeah,
do something going.
there's no incentive to. I've been a regulator in Iceland and also here, in a capacity here. There's very rarely an incentive to go after the biggest thing you can find. I mean, I like to do it because it's fun for me, but there's not much in it. You lose your job eventually, as I did in Iceland, and I lost my first they were taking my team out from under me without really telling me, and then because we had no enforcement capacity at the there was no investigator at the regulator before I and the other guy were hired, and eventually we got a small team of like 15 people. And we just started doing these cases. I mean, to me, these cases were just the baseline. And then we were going to do the insider cases, and then we were going to look at other institutions in the stock market, like to your point. So we had a whole plan for about a 5 or 7 year set of investigations, which, like in Enron's case, it took 5 years. So I said, okay, well, we have time. It took me 18 months to get any resources at all, but we finally had resources, and I was like, okay, now we're going. And we sent the two teams sent about 70 cases to the prosecutor, and we were really like going. Because when I started, I was doing all the email analysis on Outlook. We didn't even have a tool to read emails or to scan emails. So we built up all that capability, and by 2011, early 2012, it was taken apart. And they don't have it today. They don't have an enforcement team. And then a couple of years ago, they took the regulator, so like the FINMA, the FME, and they rolled it back into the central bank. So it doesn't even have independence anymore from central bank. And one of the craziest things that I didn't talk about was, as the banks were collapsing, the central bank gave 500 million in cash to Kaupthing, which was a substantial part of the foreign reserves of the country. They gave it to them. The collateral was a Danish commercial bank. It wasn't even allowed in the statutes of the central bank that they could take equity in a bank as collateral, but they did. They gave them the cash disappeared, and 2 days later, Kaupthing collapsed. And so that 500 million is still in discussion in Iceland today. It was never, like I wanted to investigate it, and they were like, no, you can't investigate the central bank. And I was like, yeah, but they're a bank. We're the regulator of banks, let's go look. You know, they're, no. So that's never been investigated. That's still brought up every couple of years. It comes up. And so, but now the central bank is the regulator again. So
What would you be looking for if you are trying to detect such a share buyback scheme? banking today, what kind of signs or what are the elements that you would be looking at?
That's a really good question. I think you could look at macro things like these banks' share prices did not go down in 2007. When every bank in the world, especially if you just compare to the other Nordic banks, the share price was going down. And nobody could explain that, and nobody could explain why the banks loan, you could look at common ratios for banks. And I'm not an expert on banks, but for example, the loan loss provision of the banks was, I think, like 0.5% for the Icelandic banks. And the European average was like 2.5%. So there were indications that like all was not well in just the public statements of the banks. And if you do like a DuPont breakdown, you could see like I did this for Exista. Oh, so Kaupthing, the biggest bank, was accused, or 2006, they were like, there's too much cross-shareholding between these. So what they did is they spun off this thing called Exista, which was just kind of a post office box that owned shares of Kaupthing. And then they owned shares of that. And Exista was also probably manipulating its own share price. That's another thing we didn't get to dig into. But when I looked at the Exista financials over a few years, they had consistent return on equity, but they were only getting that by just leverage. So they were just levering up more and more each year too. So there were signs for any serious investor who knows about investing in bank stocks, for example, that these banks had real problems. And that's what came out in 2006, that they had problems, but they just kept going with the party. And they used the share price. It was a key piece when they went to, later they went to Wall Street, they went to Asia, they went to Japan, and they always showed the share price when they borrowed money, and they were able to borrow much more than their equity. And the healthy share price, which they had created, was then a key piece of their being able to continue to grow. But nobody in Iceland knows this today, by the way.
Really? So this wasn't sufficiently publicized?
It's very.
Yeah. I mean, all the big cases.
Persona non grata.
What's that?
Are you persona non grata to Iceland?
I hope not. I don't know.
So what does the taxi driver says today about the bank?
Well, the story, as far as I can tell, and the caveat is I haven't lived there in 10 years, almost 10 years. But the story is that we had a great banking system, and Lehman came, and there was a financial crash, and the banks crashed. And otherwise we would have been fine. And now the banks they're all the same banks still exist. They have changed their names. It's like at the end of, it's like in Spinal Tap when they keep changing their name. The banks have, so Kaupthing is now Ardion, Landsbanki is now Landsbankin, which means the Landsbanki. And Glitnir was the third one, has changed. It was originally Icelandsbanki, and it's gone back to being Icelandsbanki. So they're all still there, and they have, as far as I can tell, maybe 50-60% of the workforce that they had back in 2008 also. So there's still a lot of people in them. I don't know what they do all day. But Kaupthing, the biggest one, they came out a couple of months ago and they said, we want to be the leading bank of the Arctic. With global warming, Arctic is going to be important. It's going to be a big trade area. We want to be the bank of the Arctic. They said maybe they said Iceland could be the financial sector of the Arctic. So it's back to the same story.
So when do we short?
Good luck borrowing some shares.
What about the convicted people? Are they back at the the CEO of the main bank went as a CEO of the second bank and?
No, a lot of them, they have a pretty low profile, but they were able to keep. They never had any financial penalties, I don't believe, and they had a lot of money offshore. And so what I've heard is that that's being repatriated to buy hotels, and because now Iceland. By the way, how did Iceland recover? It became a tourist ghetto, or so it became kind of
Cheap flights.
cheap flights and 10 tourists pre-COVID it was 10 tourists per person per year. And so,
3 million tourists.
yeah, I think so. And all of, like, my old neighborhood is like a lot of Airbnbs now. And some of our favorite places that we used to go, I know Keith from those days, they have, so there was a great restaurant we always went on Sundays, Vegamot. And Vegamot is a beautiful Icelandic word. It's Vegur is like German for road. Veg in Icelandic, Vegur, Veg in German. And Vegamot is where the roads meet. So it's the word for an intersection. It's a nice word, nice name for a bar. And that place was like, I was there for, I don't know, 2 decades or something. It was a bar, restaurant. It became a nightclub. These things have to do multiple things in Reykjavik. But it was a kind of institution. And now they've changed their name to The Bastard. Because that's, I guess, cool for tourists to go to a bar called The Bastard. I mean, it's really sad for me to go there because I like it there. I miss it, but a lot of what made it special to me has changed. But that's the nature of things, I guess. All right, I think I'm going to drink some water and sign some books.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. This is the pen.
That's the pen.
The pen. Thank you so much for having me and for buying these books.
This is the first candidate.
Okay. Should I sign it to you or?
It would be an honor to me.
Okay. And you're sorry, what's your name?
Slava.
Slava. S-L-A-V-A.
Yes, yes.
Oui.
Thank you.
That will take like maybe a minute to dry.
To dry.
My name is Frank.
Frank?
So what are you doing now?
I just got a mandate with the UN. I've been doing a lot of work on sustainable finance.
Okay.
But I've also been, I hope to get mandates to do investigations this year, like with FINMA. I have my own firm.
Do you live in Switzerland?
I live in Italy, but I've been here almost 10 years.
Okay.
That's another Icelandic thing for you. Shinu Fretto. It means 7, 9, 13, you say when,
7, 9, 13.
for good luck. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Nog að gera, it says for you.
Okay.
Nog að gera. Enough to do. That's what you wanted, right?
Yeah.
Enough. Okay.
I think the name of the old bar,
What's that?
like the
You-
crossing, the road crossing.
You want that in there?
I think that,
Okay.
rather than the festival.
What's your name?
Claire.
So you have plenty of jobs.
No, nobody wants me.
So what do you want Everybody is scared.
I've been doing a lot of consulting on sustainable finance for the World Wildlife Fund, for sustainable finance. Now I'm starting a project with the UN in Geneva tomorrow. I want to do this type of investigation, but people know
Yeah.
that I'm really going
You
to
are
do
good
it.
at it. So
And
they
a
don't
lot of people
want
don't.
it. Your
Yeah.
experience.
If you don't mind a selfie, which I can tweet
Yeah, sure.
It's okay with you?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, because you're not fascinating.
Okay, thanks. Thanks.
Fine.
Do you want to hold? Do you want the book in there too?
Yeah, you can.
Did you know this?
Do you know that?
On Android phones, you could just
Yeah.
Wait,
Face, yeah. That's cool.
Technologies are improving.
Yeah.
The humans are still not. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks
and
for your
your
questions. It was
My
really
pleasure.
nice.
Thank you.
Hi guys.
I bought my ad.
So this has never been. This is the American version.
Oh, I got it from the UK.
Yeah, but this is the U.S. printing.
Well, good. That's the one. I mean,
Did you get it from Book Depository? Yeah, what they did is they ordered. For some reason, that must have been cheaper.
What's the difference?
Look.
Spellings or-
No, no, not the spelling. They didn't. I thought they were going to do that.
Oh, it's
See, there's black. And
Oh, interesting.
this is much nicer. I hate to say that the American thing is nicer, but this one is. See the paper? It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't.
Tid, Keith, Ease, Case, How's that? Boris, you have all these extras.
Can I get a copy too?
Oh, of course.
This is
You can have as many as you like.
I have one of the offices for home.
Okay.
But everyone I spoke to is very keen to read the book, even non-finance people.
Yeah, it's written for anybody. Yeah, you read it, so
Yeah.
what do you think?
I think it's
I
excellent.
think except for the CDS part, people are complaining about that a little bit. But
I mean, to those that understand what it is, it's very important that even
It
if
is,
want-
right?
They, want
They
to
went
have
that
to go
far.
that far.
yeah, yeah. This is the problem with this kind, but it does a good job.
It does, yeah. It really feels.
This was my dream pen,
Okay.
and
Nice.
there's a pen store in Zurich, and
So you took advantage from the
the-
trip, or?
the Japanese company that was making them, they came to Zurich once. This pen is very hard. Was now they make a lot, but it was very hard to get.
Okay.
And they said, and I was planning, if I got a book contract, I was planning to get this pen as a gift for myself. But that was pushing me to get the book contract. But then the Japanese were there in Zurich, and they said, you have to order it now in the next minute, or you won't get it. So I ordered it and I got it, and it was like a year and a half before I got the book contract.